I would say basically the whole regulatory state under the Biden administration was hostile to Bitcoin in a whole lot of different ways. Bitcoin takes power away from the state in terms of deciding the supply of money. If we move to a Bitcoin standard, there's just going to be a fixed monetary policy. There's not going to be a Federal Reserve that decides the price of money or how much money there will be. So this is something a lot of my clients, and I directly saw. I have Bitcoin on my website because I serve Bitcoin clients, but I'm not a crypto company. I'm not issuing a token. I'm just a regular old law firm that helps Bitcoin companies comply with the law. What changed recently is there is the first piece of crypto federal legislation passed called the Genius Act. I actually think this is the first piece of financial legislation, I might be wrong, but I think in about a century, that was passed not as a result of a financial crisis. But the government can come and find you, right? You are not immutable, right? You do not have the properties of Bitcoin. And so if you live in a country, you're going to have to deal with the fact that there is a government there. Undoubtedly, there's been a dramatic shift over these 7 months. So this issue of money transmission and the Bank Secrecy Act is an area where I do have frustration with the current administration. I think they should be doing more here.
Before we get started with all the topics and with all the things that do, and there's a lot of interesting stuff currently going on, maybe give the viewers and the listeners some overview of like who you are and especially why you're excited about Bitcoin.
Absolutely. My name's Zack Shapiro. I wear two hats in the Bitcoin space. One is that I run a corporate law firm. I represent Bitcoin and crypto startups. I help people raise money, navigate regulatory challenges, and generally sort of grow their businesses sort of from a legal perspective. I'm also the head of policy at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, which is a DC-based think tank focused on Bitcoin. Our mission at BPI is to educate policymakers about Bitcoin and what we think good policy looks like with regard to Bitcoin. And my specific job there as head of policy is to help decide what policy areas to focus on and what our specific position should be in each of those areas.
Interesting. I've seen an interview with, I think, Frank Korva and you around the Samurai wallet thing, and I think they have recently changed their plea from like not guilty to guilty. I haven't really observed it in the detail, of course. And then I actually never covered it on the podcast, so I was like, I want to take a small portion of this podcast to focus on this a little bit. What is, for the people that maybe have never heard about the whole case, what is kind of the main focus of that and what's going on there?
Absolutely. So by way of background, Samurai Wallet was a non-custodial Bitcoin wallet. Non-custodial means that users held their own keys. The wallet and the software did not sort of custody Bitcoin on behalf of users, but it was software that allowed users to generate their own private keys to hold their own Bitcoin. What sort of made Samurai Wallet unique among Bitcoin wallets is that it was a privacy-focused wallet. So it had two features that helped people spend their Bitcoin privately. As probably many of your listeners know, the Bitcoin blockchain itself is pseudonymous, but totally public. So I don't have to register with my name and ID to get a Bitcoin address. But if someone can associate an address with my identity, you can trace all of my transactions. You could see, how much money I have. You can see who I've done business with, and this can be a problem sort of in day to day. If I'm paid via Bitcoin, I might not want my employer to know my exact net worth and who I've done business with. If I'm, buying the proverbial cup of coffee with Bitcoin, the person who I'm buying coffee from, maybe I don't want them to see every other transaction I've done. And we're used to sort of some level of financial privacy in the traditional world. If you pay for something with a credit card, the vendor that accepts your credit card doesn't know everything about your financial history. And certainly when you use cash, that's quite a private way of buying things. And so there are two ways that Samurai Wallet helped users protect their privacy and anonymity. One is called a coin join. A coin join is a collaborative transaction where a bunch of people spend the same amount of Bitcoin at the same time as part of the same transaction to help obscure where the funds are going from and to. And so there are different sort of pools within Samurai CoinJoin. Samurai ran a software called a coordinator, which helped people find each other who wanted to make the same amount of Bitcoin anonymous. So let's say I've got my main stack in cold storage, and I want to have 5 million Satoshis, 5% of a Bitcoin available that I can spend in a private way. I would join the 5 million Satoshi Samurai pool along with a bunch of other people who wanted to make 5 million Satoshis worth of Bitcoin anonymous. We would all spend essentially 5 million sats from one address that we own to another address we own, but at the same time. And so now we all end up with these inferences that are harder to make between the send and receive address, even though the Bitcoin was in our possession the whole time. Also, they had this tool called Ricochet, which allowed you to add extra hops. There were exchanges out there that didn't like to deal with people who use privacy technologies like CoinJoins, and so they just wouldn't accept something that had come from a Samurai pool. And so Ricochet allowed you to, for example, send your coins to Coinbase, but add a couple extra sort of unnecessary steps in the way, so it's harder to tell, are you the person who used a CoinJoin or not? And so this service was used by lots of different people. It was one of the biggest CoinJoin services. Now, meanwhile, the Samurai developers had gotten a legal opinion from their lawyer, quite good regulatory lawyer who's been around in the space for a long time, that what they were doing is perfectly legal. There are illicit finance regulations that apply to certain actors in the Bitcoin space based on whether you accept and transmit other people's money. So the sort of most up-to-date guidance that the government has put out on this was in 2019, called the 2019 FinCEN guidance. And basically it said if you are a non-custodial wallet, that the Bank Secrecy Act, the requirement to KYC AML does not apply to you because essentially you're just putting out software. It's sort of like, Apple is not responsible for people who use MacBooks to commit crimes. Right? A USB cable manufacturer is not responsible for someone who uses their USB cable to commit wire fraud. However, a bank, right, or an ATM company is responsible for KYCing who they do business with because they hold other people's money, and so they're regulated sort of under banking laws. And there was this understanding among crypto lawyers that this sort of custodial versus non-custodial line was sort of the question about whether you were subject to KYC, AML, or subject to the Bank Secrecy Act or not. What happened in the Samurai Wallet case, and in a very similar case with an Ethereum tool called Tornado Cash, is the government arrested the developers and charged them, among other things, for unlicensed money transmission. They said, despite the fact that the way Samurai Wallet worked was non-custodial, they did not accept or transmit anyone's funds, nevertheless, the government is going to hold them responsible as if they did because they facilitated other people's transmission of funds. And this got my attention because if you sort of really think carefully about the government's argument here, that argument can be applied to almost any real use of Bitcoin. If all you have to do to be responsible for KYC AML is to help other people transmit their funds, well, let's think about who else helps people transmit funds. Anyone who makes a cold wallet, right, or a hardware wallet. They help people generate private keys and spend funds. Anyone who runs a node, if I use a Ledger wallet to store my Bitcoin and I use the Ledger Live software to do transactions, Ledger's node is broadcasting my transactions. So they are facilitating my movement of funds. What about Bitcoin miners? Bitcoin miners, their whole thing is they create blocks, they add transactions to the blockchain. They're facilitating the movement of funds. What about the company that makes the plastic that is the casing for a Ledger wallet? Well, they created the device that allowed me to generate, there is basically no end, right? There's no logical endpoint to this argument that the government is making. And so it sets this really dangerous precedent that basically any sovereign use of Bitcoin would be subject to the Bank Secrecy Act. And it really would be sort of a backdoor ban on the use of Bitcoin in America. And so the government sort of proceeded with this theory, and the case was going to proceed to trial. The defendants were, in addition to this money transmission charge, also charged with a conspiracy to commit money laundering. The charge says that they were intentionally helping criminals launder funds. And, no doubt there were some people that were using Samurai Wallet for bad purposes or to hide sort of proceeds from crimes like hacking or other sort of internet-based crimes. And the money laundering charge came with a up to 20-year sentence, which is sort of really hard to face if you're a person and you're going to trial. There's a quite pro-government sort of hostile to the defense judge in this case. And what happened this week, so we're recording on July 31st, yesterday on July 30th, the defendants both pled guilty to that money transmission charge, as illogical as it is, because they weren't transmitting anyone's money, because the sort of prospect of going to trial on the money laundering charge, where they could have gotten multiple decades in prison, it was just too hard to bear.
So the implications of that, if that would be, so the trial is not over, they're just changing the plea. I'm not.
No, there's no trial. When you plead guilty, you give up your right to a trial, and they are just going to be sentenced to prison.
So now the implications of that is that the same argument could now be used to kind of force services like Bitcoin mining, hardware wallets, the things that you kind of mentioned before, that they also have to do KYC everyone.
That's the worry. But when you really think about it, they can't, right? If you're a Bitcoin miner, right? If you understand sort of how Bitcoin mining works, if you're a mining pool, if you're a hashing company, you actually can't KYC anyone. So it's not just that there's a KYC requirement, it's a ban on mining in the United States if they were to apply it that way. Or, taken to its logical endpoint, it's a ban on self-custody, because it now becomes illegal to provide the software or hardware to allow people to self-custody if you're going to be treated as violating the Bank Secrecy Act by not KYCing people. If you think about, for example, the hardware manufacturers, Ledger, Trezor, Cold Card, BitBox, you name it, there's not really a way that they have to KYC people. It's just a piece of hardware, right? A kitchen knife can be used for a murder, or it can be used to cut a steak. And normally we don't hold the kitchen knife manufacturer responsible for people who use their knives to commit murder. But that's really what the theory of these prosecutions in Samurai Wallet and Tornado Cash are doing. So that is a really big concern. And the most important way that we have to mitigate that concern is a law called the Clarity Act, which just passed the United States House of Representatives. A similar bill is going to be voted on in the Senate probably sometime this fall. And there is language in that bill, in Section 109 of the Clarity Act, that would basically prevent the government from doing prosecutions like this in the future and protect software developers and Bitcoin users.
What are other implications of that? Is there something beyond that could come as a bad or as a consequence from that for the Bitcoin or for the Bitcoin ecosystem?
From the precedent set by these prosecutions? Yeah, I mean, I think it's about as bad a precedent as you can get. I don't think that this administration is going to maliciously use this precedent. I mean, first of all, this is not binding precedent, this guilty plea. It's sort of very informal precedent. But let's say we get a future United States president that is hostile to Bitcoin, someone like Elizabeth Warren, who wants to ban Bitcoin. Elizabeth Warren is sort of the biggest antagonist to Bitcoin in the United States government. She tried to pass a bill which essentially bans Bitcoin by doing the same thing that this court case did. It's called the Digital Asset Anti-Money Laundering Act, or DAMLA. I think she introduced it in 2022. And what this law does is it doesn't say on its face that it bans Bitcoin, but it treats everyone in the ecosystem, node runners, miners, lightning routing nodes, you name it, as money transmitters, knowing full well that they can't comply with money transmission laws. It's just not possible, right? Because these are peer-to-peer technologies. This is just software. This is not a business. And that was sort of her grand plan to ban Bitcoin. Thankfully, that bill didn't go anywhere, but you really could, with a Department of Justice that works for a president that is more hostile to the Bitcoin ecosystem than the current Trump administration is, you could see this precedent being weaponized against people in the Bitcoin space. And that really is a concern.
Is that also, as far as I know, the app was completely open source. So is that also kind of an attack on just open source in general?
Sure. I mean, I really think the precedent is, specific precedent that we worry about here is more about non-custodial technology, whether or not it's open source. The Bank Secrecy Act says that you are a money transmitter if you accept and then transmit funds on behalf of the public. The plain reading of that language is, between accepting funds and transmitting them, you have to have the funds. You have to have custody or control of the funds, or else you're not accepting or transmitting. If we twist that language into a bizarre way to say that you can be a money transmitter and accept and transmit funds without having custody of those funds, that's, leads to these illogical places. And then if you think about sort of from a high level, the history here, right? Bitcoin was not the first attempt at peer-to-peer eCash. There was DigiCash, Eagle, Liberty Reserve, the sort of cypherpunk movement that came out of the 70s and culminated in the creation of Bitcoin in 2008, really had this goal of true peer-to-peer electronic cash that only worked when Satoshi invented sort of proof of work that solved the Byzantine generals problem, and secured by public-private key cryptography. And the reason that's so important is that by having the proof of work consensus mechanism, you can send funds on a peer-to-peer basis without a centralized clearinghouse like some of these other earlier attempts had. If you look at the history of things like eGold or Liberty Reserve, they worked for a while until the government just arrested the people who were the administrators, right? The people who maintain the ledger. And Bitcoin didn't have that fate because there is no company, there is no central authority that maintains the ledger. The ledger is a peer-to-peer ledger. And sort of the meta problem that we're facing with these cases is that our illicit finance laws, including the Bank Secrecy Act is the biggest one of them, were written at a time when if you had an electronic transfer of money, necessarily there was a regulated financial intermediary in the middle of that transaction. If I Venmo you money, it feels like the money is going right from my phone to yours, but that's not what's happening. It's my bank talking to your bank. And if we don't have the same bank, there are multiple correspondent banks in between. And even though it seems like it's settling instantly on the Venmo ledger, the actual money is settling on the sort of Swift or FedNow system, in a couple weeks, right? These are long, complicated transactions, and each of the intermediaries in that transaction are federally regulated banks that are subject to the Bank Secrecy Act. That's not how Bitcoin transactions work. If I give you Bitcoin, there's not a bank, there's not a regulated entity in the middle. It really is more like I hand you a paper bill, right? It is just the money going from me to you with nothing in between. And the sort of laws we have aren't set up for that possibility. And so we're at a point where we either need to modernize our laws to recognize the just technological fact that Bitcoin and blockchain exists and electronic peer-to-peer transactions are possible and happen all the time, every day. Or we can try and shoehorn the old laws that don't fit into the new technology, and you get this result of we're going to throw software developers in prison for essentially publishing code.
It's super interesting, all those developments, because we hear a lot of positive news for Bitcoin, especially from the Trump administration. But then this seems to be something that is not too much in the news. Not a lot of people actually talk about that, and it's something that can have really bad implications in the future. What is kind of like your look in general at the Trump administration? I think we have now, 7 months of where he worked in the administration, and the different acts that come out of that, the different policies that might change. 7 months is not too long, but there are some things that are moving already.
Yeah, well, look, there's been a dramatic shift over these 7 months. So this issue of money transmission and the Bank Secrecy Act is an area where I do have frustration with the current administration. I think they should be doing more here. They put out a memo a couple months back called the Blanche Memo from the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, saying that they were not going to go after software developers for the way that people used their software. And yet they let the Samurai Wallet and Tornado Cash cases go forward, which I think was a grave error. But in general, it is a night and day difference between what we had in the Biden administration in all sorts of ways. So I would say basically the whole regulatory state under the Biden administration was hostile to Bitcoin in a whole lot of different ways, Bitcoin and the broader sort of digital asset or crypto ecosystem. The reason for this, largely speaking, is what seems to have been a political deal between Biden and Elizabeth Warren when she dropped out of the race in 2020. It seems like she was given a lot of staffing authority in the Biden administration. She got to pick who ran various agencies. So she was the one who was responsible for Gary Gensler being at the SEC and sort of targeting Bitcoin and crypto companies. If you look at the tail end of the Biden administration, when we finally got spot Bitcoin ETFs approved, not because the SEC decided to allow them, but because the SEC was sued by Grayscale and a federal court forced them to approve the Bitcoin ETFs. There's this just incredibly salty opinion from Gary Gensler about how Bitcoin's not safe. And, at the one hand, he says we are asset neutral. We're not taking a position about what's good or what's bad. And then he just goes to shit on Bitcoin repeatedly and gratuitously. There's similar sort of lawfare against the rest of the crypto space with lawsuits by the SEC against Coinbase, against Binance, against, almost everyone there. There was Operation Choke Point 2.0, which is from another branch of the Biden administration, the FDIC, which put pressure on banks not to accept just dollar deposits from Bitcoin and crypto startups. This is something a lot of my clients and to some extent I directly saw. I have Bitcoin on my website because I serve Bitcoin clients, but I'm not a crypto company. I'm not issuing a token. I'm just a regular old law firm that helps Bitcoin companies comply with the law. And it was really difficult for me to get a escrow account with a large bank because they didn't, just the risk of doing business with anyone associated with Bitcoin or crypto in the Biden administration was seen as really high. Then you had the DOJ that brought these prosecutions against open source developers. And so the biggest shift with the current administration is the end of this, I think, really misguided war on crypto. And I got to give a lot of credit for that to people like David Bailey that saw early on that this was a political opportunity to win hearts and minds. And then companies like Coinbase that poured a ton of money, something like $140 million into the Fair Shake PAC, which both acted in the presidential election and then on both sides of the aisle in Congress, supporting both Democrats and Republicans that were pledging to be pro-crypto as opposed to anti-crypto. So the biggest shift we've seen is just the end of the hostility that we saw from the previous administration. I would say the other big thing that we're seeing, a real shift, is that the administration is taking Bitcoin and crypto very seriously. Now, sometimes there are what looks like conflicts of interest. The president and his family are obviously personally involved in various Bitcoin and crypto ventures. They've got a DeFi project called World Liberty Financial. They have interest in a Bitcoin treasury company, in a Bitcoin mining company. They own a lot of Bitcoin and crypto. But they've also put people in power across the federal bureaucracy who understand this industry, who are trying to get it right. And then, I can say, sort of wearing my BPI hat, the types of conversations that we are having with both the administration and with congressmen and senators are just so much more substantive and detailed than they ever were. We've seen in the past that, there were some lawmakers who sort of wanted to be directionally pro-Bitcoin, pro-crypto, but they didn't really understand it. They just kind of wanted to cheerlead from the side. And now we're having like real conversations about policies around Bitcoin mining, around software development, around, what should states or the federal government hold Bitcoin on their balance sheet as a hedge against monetary debasement and to, be a bolster for dollar strength long term. How can Bitcoin mining stabilize power grids? Like these are interesting, detailed conversations that the administration is taking really seriously. That sort of culminated in the other thing that happened yesterday, which is the publication of a 168-page crypto report, which is a really interesting, comprehensive document laying out the administration's recommendations for Bitcoin and crypto policy, including on the final page the funding of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, where there's my favorite part of the report, which is a footnote describing the administration's plan to accumulate more Bitcoin for the federal government as stacking sats, and defining in this document from the White House what stacking sats means.
I love that. I did not know that. That's interesting. Why does it matter that the governments and the states are accumulating Bitcoin? I love that they are calling it stacking sats.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question. I think if you were to zoom out and look at what geopolitical moment we're in right now, we are exiting a world of U.S. political and military hegemony, and also monetary hegemony. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we took sort of the unprecedented step of seizing or freezing Russia's U.S. T-bill reserves. I think that sort of signaled the end of American treasuries as the neutral reserve asset. And since then, you can see central banks around the world accumulating gold at a huge rate, which is part of why the price of gold has gone up so much. At the same time, you see in China, they're rolling out their central bank digital currency, the CBDC, the e-yuan, that they want to use as a lever of power around the world and do trade in Africa and the Middle East in this sort of digital currency that they control. And all of these things sort of threaten to undermine the dollar as the world reserve currency to some extent, and undermine the treasury as the sort of neutral reserve asset that central banks around the world hold. At the same time, I think this is a bipartisan thing. We are spending increasing deficit amounts every year. Every opportunity we get, we spend more and more, pile on more and more debt. in the last year, I think that for the first time, the interest on our debt surpassed our military budget, which is really astonishing when you stop and think about it. There are about $6 trillion worth of unencumbered sort of like base dollars in the world, and there's over $120 trillion of dollar-denominated debt, which means that that the $6 trillion kind of have to zip around the world to satisfy like a 20 to 50x debt load, right? We're super heavily levered on our money. And so when that comes due, the next time we have a fiscal crunch, we can either have a giant Great Depression where everyone, including governments, default on their debt, or we can do what we always do, which is just make more dollars. We can print more money. And so we have these sort of dual crises of monetary debasement, which is, I think, just politically inevitable. We're not going to stop spending. We're not going to default on our debt. We're just going to make more dollars. And so the purchasing power of the dollar is going to go down over time. That's going to maybe undermine trust. And then we have this sort of geopolitical reordering of what are these sort of neutral reserve assets in the world. And the answers that we see out of the East are gold and then a CBDC. And I think that the right way to think about the U.S. answer to that, we're not going to be able to credibly say that treasuries are a neutral reserve currency. We issue them, we control the supply of them, we can freeze them if they want. Like, it's just not going to be an answer to gold. And if you look at Bitcoin holdings, well, Bitcoin has a lot of the same properties that gold does as a neutral reserve asset. It has, if anything, a tighter capped supply than gold. It moves faster than gold around the world. It is easier to safely store. All right, because you can do sort of distributed multi-sig custody as opposed to gold has to sit in a vault. And interestingly, the distribution of Bitcoin is much greater as a percentage in America than the distribution of gold. More of the gold is abroad than the Bitcoin is abroad. And so as a geopolitical policy, the United States government buying Bitcoin, putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet as a neutral asset, sort of monetizing Bitcoin, inures to the benefit of the United States and inures to the detriment of our geopolitical adversaries. And so I think it's a really smart move in that regard. And then secondly, I think stablecoins are a very powerful tool to keep the relevance of the dollar around the world. There's a lot of dollar demand that's unsatisfied because people, especially in authoritarian countries, can't get access to US bank accounts. And it's dangerous and difficult to get access to physical US currency, to like $100 bills. But anyone with a smartphone or a seed phrase can hold Tether. So stablecoins, I think, are an important part of this equation. But the dollar is not going to be a good store of value. We just know that. It's sort of baked in. Nothing stops that particular train. And so to maintain sort of the credibility of U.S. money and to allow the United States to keep being able to issue debt, because we do need to debt finance some things, in order to not have this sort of spiral where we're raising money with dollars that are worth less and less, and eventually people don't want to buy our debt. If we have a large reserve of this neutral digital commodity that many of us think is going to 10 or 100x in price over the next decade, that's a really smart way for the United States to be able to project neutrality, project financial stability, and keep being able to borrow. And then at the state level, the problem's even worse, right? Because the states, unlike the federal government, they can't issue debt in the form of T-bills, which is a neutral reserve asset, or at least was. They don't get to print the world reserve currency. They don't get to create endless debt. They have to balance their budget. And at the same time, states have long-term, really intense liabilities. They have pension plans. They have infrastructure that they need to support. And they have the same problem that all of us have, where the dollar is not a great store of value. And if you want to get real returns, buying companies, buying the Mag 7, buying the S&P 500 at sort of ridiculous multiples that are created by everyone DCAing whatever wealth they have left over into their 401k in the S&P 500, because that's really the money that like middle class or higher America saves in. That's probably not going to keep up with the cost of these liabilities because these companies are so expensive. And so holding this neutral reserve asset that can't be debased, at least some of it, right, to balance out the dollar denominated liabilities, right, or lifestyle denominated liabilities. If you have a pension plan, you want people to be able to afford food for the rest of their lives. You want people to be able to afford shelter. And if you have a fixed set of dollars to work with, that's going to get harder and harder. Whereas if you have a sort of pile of Bitcoin on the side to balance out dollar weakness, that becomes a really powerful lever for states. And so public investment in Bitcoin, whether it is a sort of standalone strategic Bitcoin reserve, or whether it is sort of integration of Bitcoin into other investments, whether those are pension plans or securities instruments like BitBonds. At BPI, we think that is a really good and important policy.
The first time I ever made any money, I got myself from that money a watch. And ever since then, I collect timepieces to remember times where I achieved some milestone. That's why I got the Bitcoin 2025 edition when I went to my first ever American Bitcoin conference. So for me, the Bitcoin watches from Coin Vigilant represents the time that we are living in. For every person that wears a Bitcoin watch, I know they are representing sound money to the outside world. Make sure to check out those amazing Coin Vigilante timepieces down in the descriptions. I love those watches so much. I know how big of a hurdle it can be to have self-custody, but it's so freaking important to make that first step. We have to make sure it's as easy and simple as possible. And that's exactly what BitBox did. BitBox created the simplest and the easiest hardware wallet to use to get into self-custody. So get yourself a BitBox down from the link in the description. And when you use code Robin, you even get a 5% discount. The most important thing for your Bitcoin journey is not buying Bitcoin, but it's how to keep them. And yes, you have maybe the right tools, but how do you actually go ahead and stick it all together so it's the most secure for you personally? Self-custody is a deeply personalized journey. And the Bitcoin way is helping you exactly finding that correct setup for you personally. They're also helping you with securing your own cybersecurity. And if you want to go one step above all that, you can even get a consultation for a Plan B residency. Go to thebitcoinway.com/Robin and you will get a 30-minute free consultation. I want to tell you about something very special to me. It's called Microseed. If you hold your Bitcoin in self-custody, and you should, you know how critical it is to secure your seed phrase. You should not have them on paper. You should not have them on anything else than titanium. With Microseed, you can engrave your 12 or 24 word seed phrase, the entire seed phrase, onto a 1-inch small washer. Yes, just one washer. All 24 words on that one washer. You can hide that thing everywhere. And even better, you don't need to buy a new kit every time you have to get a new wallet. You can make unlimited backups because Microseed is not selling the washer. Microseed is selling the device that stamps the washer. So you get the full kit with the device, with the washers, with the hammer, with everything you need to get started today. And you can make with that unlimited amount of backups. Go now to microseed.io. Again, that's microseed.io to get your last backup tool you ever need. You mentioned stablecoins, and it's interesting. There's this meme going around where last Bitcoin conference, there was a lot of stablecoin talk. And it seems like the administration is also very, very bullish and pushing stablecoins a lot. How does stablecoins fit in this whole thing, and why do you think there's such a big push for stablecoins just to create more demand across the world for dollars?
Yeah. So what I would say is, let's start with where stablecoins are now, and then how they fit into policy. Right now, there are sort of two pretty different uses of stablecoins in the United States and abroad. By far, the biggest use of stablecoins is abroad. It's not in the United States. Mostly, when we're talking about stablecoins outside the United States, we're talking specifically about Tether, right? There's over $200 billion of Tether outstanding, and mostly it is used as a store of value. It's people in countries that either want to have some of their money outside of the reach of their government. This is very popular, for example, in China, which has very strong capital controls. It's very hard to legally move money out of the country, but if you're holding Tether, there's not much they can do about it. Or it's in countries where, like Argentina, where there's really serious inflation, where you can hold Tether as a way to get access to dollars when dollars are otherwise hard to come by. In the United States, we use stablecoins differently. There's much more USDC in the United States, Circle's stablecoin. And here it's mostly used for payments. At the current moment, it's mostly used for international transfers of money. I've got international clients. I accept stablecoins from them. If you've ever done an international wire, it is so painful to get that done. Just going through the banking system and sending a stablecoin, by comparison, is just a joy. It's very easy. But let's go back to what we said before, sort of about how payment rails work. When you send a Venmo payment, while it feels like it's efficient and instant, really what's going on is one bank talking to another bank, talking to another bank. This is like an inefficient system with a lot of middlemen and costs. When you buy something with a credit card, Visa and MasterCard are charging rent on those transactions for using their ledger to the tune of like 3% or more if you're using American Express. And stablecoins, in theory, because they operate on a peer-to-peer basis, right? They operate on open blockchains where the fees can be very, very low, depending on what blockchain you're using, right? So think, some blockchains, the layer 1, like Solana, are just very fast and cheap to use, or layer 2s on blockchains like Ethereum or Bitcoin, right? They're developing Tether on the Lightning Network. If you've ever done a Lightning transaction, it's basically instant and free. Imagine moving dollars that way instead of using the slow and clunky and heavily regulated banking system or using the expensive credit card networks. There's just a lot of efficiency to be gained there. And so crypto native folks have been using stablecoins for a while, but there's a lot of FUD out there, I think specifically about Tether, that it's not banked, that it's not backed, that it's a Ponzi scheme, whatever, that it's, they haven't done the right kind of audit. And large businesses, large payments companies or banks that are not crypto native, that are sort of more conservative and that are larger, they've been really reluctant to get involved with the stablecoins because, even once Trump got elected, it might be that the Trump administration is very friendly to the use of stablecoins. But what if we get a different administration? That policy could change. And they when they move in size. And so, they've been reluctant to make that bet. What changed recently is there is the first piece of crypto federal legislation passed called the Genius Act. I actually think this is the first piece of financial legislation, I might be wrong, but I think in about a century, that was passed not as a result of a financial crisis, like Dodd-Frank was. And this set out a federal regulatory framework for stablecoins. And so I think as a business case, we are likely to see non-crypto native large institutions, whether those are banks, large asset managers like BlackRock, payments companies like Stripe, brokerages like Robinhood, these companies, because stablecoins are just a more efficient way to move dollars than the legacy system, they are going to embrace stablecoins. Now, turning to the policy perspective, stablecoins are good for the United States government in two specific ways. One is they keep dollar relevance. There is a lot of demand for dollars that goes unsatisfied, especially, like we said, in authoritarian countries or countries where there's capital flight. And stablecoins create, they are a distribution mechanism for dollars. And so they help keep dollars as the world reserve currency. And then separately, especially under the Genius Act, if you're going to issue a stablecoin, you have to back it with safe instruments like treasury bills, which is to say U.S. government debt. And when a lot of your listeners will be aware of sort of monetary debasement and, how much do you need to be paid to hold U.S. government debt? The yield can go up a lot if we think the value of the dollar is going to go down. And something that can meaningfully counteract that is if there's a lot of demand for stablecoins, there will then have to be a lot of demand for U.S. debt to back those stablecoins, right? Companies like Tether and Circle are going to have to buy a ton of U.S. treasuries. I think right now, even, before the Genius Act is like fully rolled out, Tether is holds 4% of all U.S. treasuries. That's a pretty meaningful chunk. And so we've had statements from the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. He thinks $2 to $3 trillion of demand for U.S. government debt will come from stablecoins. That's why the government thinks it's a big deal and it's good for the United States.
It reminds me a little bit of Bretton Woods 2.0, of the USA is pushing stablecoins into the world and they are holding Bitcoin the same as with US dollars and gold as the reserve. That's kind of the play.
Yeah, I think that's a good mental model, right? And I think when you think about that model of the dual US system of Bitcoin reserves and payment stablecoins, Bretton Woods is a good mental model, but you also have to recognize that there is a sort of competitor to that. There is a parallel version coming out of China, which is going to be CBDCs plus gold. And so these are going to be two systems that I think will end up competing with each other on the world stage.
Interesting. I'm super interested because the Bitcoiners often, I mean, now a little bit less, but often are very opposed to politics at all. Like they don't want to have suits. They don't want to have the whole thing at all. And they're like, hey, we are cypherpunks and we're just like, rolling with our Bitcoin anyways. And we don't care what politics says. I'm kind of on and off. I'm sometimes more ingrained with politics and sometimes less. Do you think in general, Bitcoiners should care more about politics, because that's kind of the place where we where we talk about how we live together?
Well, everyone has their own tolerance for politics writ large. But yes, I do think Bitcoiners should care more about politics in general, because politics cares about them. I think there are a lot of bad ideas out there sort of in the Bitcoin community about the government can't do anything about Bitcoin. You can't confiscate it. The government can't change, the blockchain. So have fun staying poor. Okay, maybe. But the government can come and find you, right? You are not immutable, right? You do not have the properties of Bitcoin. And so if you live in a country, you're going to have to deal with the fact that there is a government there. And Bitcoin is in the process of monetizing. It's in the process of going from a sort of niche internet community thing to a macro global asset. And the government is going to take an interest in that, whether you want them to or not. And this could either be a highly antagonistic relationship between the government and the monetization of Bitcoin, which we saw glimpses of in the previous administration, or it can be a collaborative relationship that is good for Bitcoiners and gives Bitcoiners a seat at the table. I think like we're beginning to see a little bit with this administration. And so I think there's a big difference in how the government deals with this transition. And even if, an individual Bitcoiner doesn't want to be involved in politics, I think there do need to be some of us out there that are, at least trying to help steer the ship a little bit. And I think that makes a big difference. Separately, though, if you really zoom out, at its core, I think it is true that Bitcoin takes power away from the state. It takes power away from the state in terms of deciding the supply of money. If we move to a Bitcoin standard, there's just going to be a fixed monetary policy. There's not going to be a Federal Reserve that decides the price of money or how much money there will be. That was coded in the original Bitcoin code, and that'll be what it is. And that takes a lot of power away from the government. Bitcoin takes power away from states in terms of how much they can censor transactions. The reason why Bitcoin is neutral is because no one can, stop a miner anywhere in the world. All you need is a computer to do hashing, and you need a source of power, and you can validate blocks and add transactions. And so that will take away some of, for example, the sanctions ability that major governments have. And the state is probably, when they take this serious enough at the end of the day, when Bitcoin gets to a certain size, they're not going to take that lying down. We're going to do our best, but probably there's going to be some majorly antagonistic relationship with some, for example, U.S. administration in the future and Bitcoin. And the solution to that at that point in time, which I think is still a ways out, is not going to be the work we're doing in DC. It is going to be, have we built the infrastructure around Bitcoin? Have we built the cypherpunk tools that allows Bitcoin to scale to the masses in a sovereign way? And I don't know what those tools will be. I think they might look like, federated eCash mints. They might look like Arc built on Lightning. They might look like some sort of advanced version of the Lightning Network with channel factories. They might be some sort of sidechain technology that we haven't thought of yet. But that infrastructure isn't here yet. And so, I sometimes use this line. I see a lot of the legal work that I do and a lot of the regulatory work I do as important, but as a rearguard action. The people that are ultimately going to win this fight for us at the end of the day are the cypherpunks, are the builders. It's not the lawyers and lobbyists. But we need the lawyers and lobbyists to buy us enough time to build out the infrastructure that will let Bitcoin and Bitcoin tools win on their own merits, right? While we build out this stuff, we can't allow the government to throw software developers in jail for building non-custodial tools. Like, that's going to make this all much harder. And so, a lot of what we're doing is sort of giving the cypherpunks the leeway to do their thing, because ultimately this is a cypherpunk revolution and not a sort of political or legal revolution.
I think it's a good way to think about that, and it brings up the question of how sound money that isn't manipulated and cannot be changed and has a solid foundation and all of that. How will that then influence or impact or change politics and government. How do you think about that?
Yeah, look, I think it's really hard to say over the long term. If we're really zooming out and saying, okay, what does this look like decades from now? I would point to a lot of the same texts that I think other Bitcoiners would, like the sovereign individual, or Balaji's network state. I think on the margin, this empowers individuals. And here's where maybe I depart from some group of Bitcoin maximalists, and I want to see like what other technologies can be built on decentralized, censorship-resistant infrastructure. When I look at like the rest of the crypto space, one of the concepts I find really interesting are DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. And most DAOs right now, and in fact, I'd say basically all of them, they don't really work. And a lot of them are just sort of like shitcoins that are meant to be, scam the public and not have fundamental value. But if you think about, what is the fundamental breakthrough of Bitcoin? It replaced a function of the state, right? The state used monopoly of violence to say, this is fiat money. This is, what backs it, right? And it replaced the monopoly of violence in the state with game theory and cryptography. Right now, if you want to bring people and capital together to do a project, the state of the art, and this is something I do a lot in my day job, is a Delaware C Corp, right? You start a company, you incorporate it, you give equity, and then the best place to do that is the United States, because we have strong rule of law, because you have recourse to the courts. The reason why it's Delaware C Corps is the Delaware Chancery Court is sort of the best business court in America. It enforces property rights, but ultimately what the court says is what the police will do. And if the police can't handle it, the military will. And so really it's backed by, again, the monopoly of violence by the state. But what if we can use tools like AI and then sort of blockchain-based primitives, right? Think of like multi-sigs, right, as like a way to organize people. You can set in the bylaws of a company that there's like a 2 of 3 quorum in like an LLC or a corporation to be able to move funds. And you can hope that people follow the law. And if they don't follow the law, you can sue them. Or you could set up a 2 of 3 multi-sig where it's written in the code. 2 people sign keys, the money is moving. 2 people don't sign keys, it's not moving, right? And then the question is, using AI and using sort of technologies built on Bitcoin or other blockchains, can we scale up other parts of organizations that people can use to achieve goals, whether that's starting a business or funding certain projects or foundations or whatever. And maybe part of the way this plays out is you get basically sort of internet-based communities around the world that take some of the functions that are currently sort of the exclusive domain of nation states. So that's one way it could play out. I do think there's a danger. Another way it could play out is sort of regulatory capture. I think it's really important to maintain an ethos of self-custody. And I think there's some sort of, danger. I'm hardly the first person to say this, but in, Bitcoiners just getting very rich and giving up our values. And Bitcoin ends up being what some combination of BlackRock and the US government says it is. And this is why like retail level in-kind creation redemption for ETFs is really important. I think it's important to have the ability to exit to Bitcoin as opposed to sort of the ultimate decision-making power is with custodians or with miners. I'm also worried about the amount of mining concentration in the United States. The United States right now is probably, the best place to be a Bitcoin miner, especially if you're somewhere like Texas. But you can see if we get, 70 or 80% of the hash rate here, is the government going to pressure public mining companies to basically censor transactions, to have OFAC sanctions compliant blocks? And then are the sort of CEOs of these companies going to comply because they make a lot of money and they don't want to rock the boat? So I think those are basically the two extremes, right? I think it is possible over the long sweep of history that Bitcoin takes a lot of the power away from the state and helps reorganize society on a more decentralized peer-to-peer basis that sort of reflects what the Bitcoin network looks like. On the other hand, I could see Bitcoin to some extent being subsumed by the state, by Wall Street, and becoming a bit more captured than sort of the current more libertarian Bitcoin ethos.
Yeah, it's a lot of the concerns of when we're focusing a lot on just Bitcoin IOUs, matter being like ETFs or even treasury companies, or just leaving them on an exchange, however you want to do it, and just focusing on like getting the number go up technology, was not really the freedom aspect of it, the transacting freely. And it is a concern, but like a lot of people really are hardcore with Bitcoin. So I think there's like a really strong hardcore group. And as long as we have that group, this group will, with their intolerance, with not wanting to give up that right, force the freedom rights that Bitcoin has also for those people that don't really care about that. So like, I don't know, like the group just has to be big enough, the node runners and all those. So like, I just hope that the group is slowly growing and is growing faster than so fast enough so that we have always enough compared to the other forces, because there is some kind of fear that we just like, oh yeah, like let's lay on the beach, we have a lot of money, let BlackRock handle the complicated stuff. Like, and we shouldn't probably do that. That's probably a bad development for Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think that's totally right.
We have one question that I asked each and every one of my guests, and the question is, what can we learn from you besides Bitcoin?
Interesting. I think this might be Bitcoin related, because I think one of the things that Bitcoin needs the most, like I said, this is a cypherpunk revolution. We need people to build things. I spend a lot of time around people who are building businesses. My law firm primarily represents startups. We also represent some VCs and investors, but I mostly like working on the company side. I think there are probably a lot of lessons I could give about. I see people succeed building businesses. I see lots of people fail building businesses. And I think that there is a certain type of person. If you are unsatisfied with your work life, if you're willing to work really hard, I think now is the best possible time to go out and be an entrepreneur. Both sort of software tools, everything from like HR software like JustWorks or Rippling, to sort of website hosting, to payments tools like Stripe. A lot of the things that were sort of difficult and expensive about starting a business are gone. And you don't need to raise a bunch of VC money to go out there and try something. And I think now with AI, this is even sort of supercharged, right? You don't need to hire someone to write website copy anymore. ChatGPT will just do that for you. And so, if you're starting a company, I think this could be a really great time to do it. It's maybe even a way to make yourself sort of more AI proof as AI changes the economy. The first thing you want to do is make sure that you incorporate the right type of business. If this is really sort of like a personal business where you mean it to be profitable from day one, right? A service business. If you're a designer, or if you're a podcast or whatever, and you're launching something yourself, and you're going to take the proceeds and pay yourself a salary out of that, you probably want to form something like an LLC that is single taxed. Right, where the income flows through to you personally and not taxed at the corporate level. If you want to create a big scalable company where you're going to take the money and instead of paying yourself, reinvest it in the business and bring on investors and try and grow it a lot, you probably want to create a Delaware C Corp. And then, it's also a better time than it's ever been to fundraise. I'm seeing all sorts of, good VC activity. Nowadays, people mostly raise through an instrument called a SAFE. You can download that for free from the Y Combinator website. And so, I guess one of the things just to say is, if you've got a good idea, you don't need to be super well connected. You just need to sort of be relentlessly focused on how to bring that idea to bear, how to actually create it in the world, and be obsessed with the people you're serving with that idea. How am I adding value? But there are tools out there that are free or near free that are very easy. And, I think if there are any of your listeners that are interested in entrepreneurship, that's probably an area where I could be a good resource.
It's interesting because it's never been easier to start something. And it's absurd how good the tools are that we have. But so many people don't do it. And so the few people that just have the courage and the discipline to actually do it and persist with it. And I mean, I like the example also of like Jack Mallers, because like a lot of people don't know that he started, I think SAP was it, and then it was Olympus, and then only, what was it, 3 or 4 years later after he started SAP, there was Strike coming out, and then it also like took some time. So it's like those people who are persistent enough and are just unwilling to give up on something, those are winning. You don't even need to be that smart. Like
you don't, and in fact, and in fact, there's a certain level of being smart I actually think that makes it harder. I mean, I think like, this is maybe a fairly classic meme. I'm not the first one to say this, but if you've got like an IQ of over 130, it's going to make your life harder in all sorts of ways, because you're going to over ideate on stuff, and you're going to think about all the ways it can go wrong. When I think about the entrepreneurs that I work with, I think the 3 traits that I find in common with the people that are the most successful. One is creativity. You need to be able to imagine good outcomes, right? Not just bad outcomes. So, how do I find something that other people aren't doing that adds value? And then how does that scale, right? How do I grow that into something even bigger? So creativity. Number 2 is what you just mentioned. It's persistence. Building something is hard work, and doing the same thing day after day, even though it doesn't feel like it's working at the time, is the path to it eventually working. And you just need to have the motor in you to keep doing it. And not everyone's built that way, but if you are built that way, you're much, much more likely to be successful. And then third, and maybe this is actually the most important of the 3, is a bias for action. I think the difference between people who start businesses and who don't, and then of the people who start businesses, the people who are, iterate enough that they'll be successful versus, they take meetings and they think about it, whatever, and then they run out of money, is, are you always just trying stuff? Or, are you waiting around? And so, if you are starting a business, I think those are 3 things to lean into. If you're thinking about, am I the right person to start a business? I think those are 3 traits to sort of really interrogate, is this who I am? Am I creative? Do I have a bias for action? Am I persistent? But at least in my view, those are sort of the 3 keys to entrepreneurial success.
I 100% agree. And we have an intro in the podcast where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest actually is. And the question is very short. It has just 3 words. Is God real?
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I think that is one of the most important questions out there. I in undergraduate, I studied philosophy and psychology, and sort of relentlessly interested in the big questions. And the truth is that at the time when I was in school, this was like at the heyday of the new atheist movement. If you remember Christopher Hitchens and Dawkins and Harris and Dennett. And this was like at the time very revolutionary, right? That you could study the claims that religion is making through a logical lens. And I found at the time very compelling the like, okay, if you look at any of the arguments that sort of classically religious people make, it's pretty easy to tear those apart logically. Over time, I think I've softened a lot on that view. Outside of Bitcoin, I actually think another technology that is misunderstood by the world and re-examining this technology could be very powerful in a good way is psychedelics. And I think sort of my exploration in that world has broadened my mind in terms of like what is possible and what is real. And where I sort of came out at the end of like my studies in college is there are 2 questions that whether or not you believe in God are fundamentally mysterious and powerful, and not in a way that can be like reduced to a philosophical question. I think these are 2 things that we like maybe can't even answer in language, but they're nevertheless powerful mysteries. One is, what is the nature of existence? Why is there something rather than nothing? And then what is the nature of human first-person consciousness? Why is it that there is something that is like to be me? Why is it that I am seeing the world from, behind the eyes of like an evolved monkey, as opposed to, like I'm the table in front of me, or I'm an air molecule, and what's the separation between me and that? I think those are really fundamental questions. And these are the types of things that I think at its best, religion is meant to answer. And, is God real? I think, first you have to sort of define what God means. But I think some of the most compelling answers to, of how to think about these fundamental questions are, questions about what is at the ground layer of reality. I think in the West, we often think about physics and matter as being the ground layer of reality. But then there are, things in the psychedelic world. There are things in the sort of esoteric telepathy world, if you listen to telepathy tapes, that suggest actually maybe what we think of as physics, right? Some of these weird things in quantum mechanics, like the observer effect, where the state of an atom depends on whether you're looking at it or not. Maybe that suggests that actually consciousness is fundamental, right? And not matter. And if that's the case, right? If like the base of reality is consciousness, and maybe we are some sort of small part of that consciousness that emerges. I don't know if you or your listeners saw the last season of White Lotus, but there's this great scene with a Buddhist monk who's asked what death means, and he says, "Well, really, our lives are like, a drop of water, being splashed out of a lake or the ocean, and you're this, one piece of sort of individual consciousness for a while, and then when you die, you rejoin the whole. Maybe that's what the world is, and do you call that greater consciousness God?" There are people who's believe in the sort of classical, Abrahamic God that created the world and intervenes. I mean, I'd want to see more evidence from that. But I guess I'll have to give you sort of the classic lawyer answer. Is God real? It depends. And in part, it depends on what you mean by God. But I think surely our universe is big enough and mysterious enough that there is something out there that you could reasonably call God.
I love that. It's a very good one. Thank you so much, Zack, for being on the show. Before I let you go, where can people find you and the Bitcoin Policy Institute?
Absolutely. So you can find Bitcoin Policy Institute at btcpolicy.org. For anyone who's interested in getting involved in Bitcoin, we're actually just today launching this pretty incredible opportunity called Bitcoin Fellowships. I didn't know this was allowed, but external organizations are allowed to sponsor people to work on Capitol Hill. And so we are actually seeking out smart Bitcoiners to be the Bitcoin expert in DC, in federal congressmen and senators' offices. That's going to be an incredibly powerful policy tool. If this sounds interesting to you, maybe because you're at the beginning of your career and you want to learn a little bit about politics, you want to do something in Bitcoin, and you want to work on Capitol Hill, that could be a great opportunity for something like that. It could also be a great opportunity for someone towards the end of their career, right? They want to do something more meaningful. Maybe they've made some money. And they really want to help move the ball forward. I would especially encourage people to look out for that program. But our website for BPI is btcpolicy.org. My law firm's website, if you're at all inspired by this conversation to start a company and you want to chat about raising money or, is my idea going to work or is it legal, is rains.law, rains.law. And my email is Zack, Z-A-C-K @rains.law. And then probably the easiest way to find me is on X/Twitter. I'm at Zack B. Shapiro, ZACKBSHAPIRO.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zack, for being on and for taking the time. And also thank you so much for everyone that is watching and listening for joining us today. As always, I'll be back tomorrow with another episode. Bye-bye. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial advice.